How's it going, people? As I've made quite a few videos on cheap first cars with cheap insurance, I often get asked questions about how to find the best first car. So to try and answer as many of those questions as possible in one video, I'm going to give you 10 key suggestions that I have for you when buying your first car. Now you can ignore these if you want, it's just some friendly advice from someone who's been there and done that in the past. Not to mention I am now highly commended by first cars, so you know. If you want to have a look at the types of first cars that you could potentially buy, go check out my best first cars playlist that has all of my first car videos in it. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to like, comment and subscribe for more content on how to get decent first cars and cars well beyond that too. But without further ado, let's get into the video. Now, the first thing I would suggest is that you should start with the insurance and also be open to multiple different types of cars. If you take home just one thing from this video, please let it be this, because genuinely I get so many questions from people saying that they've just bought their first car and they're really struggling to find cheap insurance on it. Now, of course, there are multiple factors that affect insurance and whether it's cheap, the key one being your area, because if you're in a bad area, it can be quite peak. But I would say alongside area, the car is one of the most important factors in shaping your insurance quotes. If you've already bought a car, it becomes an absolute faff if you suddenly find out that that car is really expensive to insure. Whereas if you start by getting a bunch of quotes from price comparison sites and then finding which cars are actually the cheapest to insure, you get a little bit of a short list of the cars that you could potentially afford to run. And my advice for finding those cheaper quotes would be to look at one, rarer cars, because often rarer cars are slightly cheaper to insure and you can find those in plenty of my other videos. And two, go and watch my video on how to get cheap insurance as a first time driver. I literally did a bunch of research to find out how to get the cheapest quotes and it's helped so many people, so I would really like to help you too. Now this comes with a prerequisite that you should probably keep yourself open to multiple different types of cars and don't just fall in love with one car that you then decide to just transfix yourself on. And number two is one that you probably don't want to hear, but ultimately getting a fast first car is probably not the best idea. Even though I have literally done videos on cheap first cars that are quite quick, I genuinely recommend that not a super slow first car, but a slowish first car is pretty good for learning in. I'm quite an aggressive driver and I've been able to gain my skills at slower speeds, whereas if I'd been aggressive from the start in a faster car, I might have just caused havoc or basically gotten myself into trouble. Slow cars require you to second guess yourself, so when you've got a faster car and you're about to pull out from a tight junction or whatever, you can generally get away with it and that gets you into a sense of being quite lazy, whereas when you have a slower car, you can't always make it out of those junctions and whatever, so it makes you second guess yourself and instead start to become a better driver at kind of understanding the roads and timing everything a little bit better. And in the long run, you genuinely have so much time to get into fast cars, particularly if you're 17 getting into your first car. In the future, I'm sure you can have a nice fast car, but as your first, I genuinely recommend going for something slower. And for those of you who might like to do stuff like track days and that kind of stuff, I genuinely reckon that by driving a slower car, you actually get better car control and also get a better ability of using momentum, which is ultimately really key when it comes to driving on track. Number three, I would say that you really don't need to flex. Your first car does not need to be the best car or the best car of your friends or the best car that anyone else has at 17 years old. All it needs to be is a safe and useful car, and to be honest, the people that had the nicest cars at school ended up being the ones that changed their cars the quickest because they didn't even like them that much. They just wanted to kind of move on from that car onto something else. In fact, when I first got into driving at school, it was all the guys that actually really like cars that ended up having the cheaper stuff. Now, I'm not saying buy a death trap or buy some next old banger that is on its last legs, but what I am saying is that the car doesn't need to flex. All it needs to do is be a useful first car. That's all you need from it, which very much leads me on to my fourth point, which is that cheap is absolutely fine. When you get into your first car, you will be learning probably more than you did when you were doing your driving test. You'll be gaining experience of the roads, learning different scenarios and getting a better understanding of what actually happens out there on the roads. And if you bump or scrape an old car that isn't that expensive, that doesn't really matter too much, then you're kind of okay. But if you're driving like a brand new Mercedes A-Class or whatever as your first car and you bump or scrape it, that can be pretty hefty in terms of the impact on the car's value and also just an annoying thing that you have to deal with. Again, I'm not saying that you should go out onto the roads and have a bunch of bumps or scrapes, but if you do have a bump or scrape, which I think is more likely when you're not as good at driving, I'd much rather do it in something cheap and cheerful than something expensive that's going to really annoy annoying both myself and my parents. And number 5 is something that I think is really important. It's going to differ from person to person, but I think that you should absolutely make sure that your car makes you feel free. I often get asked, is the Mazda MX-5 or the Toyota MR2 a good first car? And I personally don't think they would have been for me because they wouldn't have suited all of my different needs. Yes, they would have been great handling cars and really fun to drive and all that good stuff, but there was so much stuff that I gained by having a rubbishy old Skoda Fabia estate. When you first get driving, you suddenly realize how much more freedom you get with the ability to go wherever you want, drive wherever you want, go to all these different places, take your friends to different places, do all that good stuff. Your car should be freeing, not something that almost gets in your way. For me, the Skoda Fabia estate did exactly that. By having 5 seats, 5 doors and a big boot, it was a perfect recipe for some incredible memories. It carried BMXs and jump bikes around. It used to take my entire university bedroom to and from Bath. I used it to travel 2,536 miles around Europe. I drove it around the Nürburgring. I used to take people to and from parties. I'd have all my mates in it. Tesco trips, big Tesco's, fam. The car was sick. Now, if I'd had something like an MX-5 as my first car instead, I wouldn't have been able to do most of those things. But that suited me and my situation. That might not suit you and your situation. Ultimately, it made me freer, and you should think about what would make you freer. A 2-seater sports car might do exactly that. I wouldn't recommend it personally, but if it does, then do it. I would just say that as much fun as it is to drive a sports car, it is probably more fun with the windows down, the music up, with all the lads on their way to big Tesco. Now, this is something that I overlooked when I was buying my first car, and something that you should try not to with yours. I got kind of lucky with it in the end, but don't forget about road tax and also ULEZ. Generally, the majority of cars that you can actually buy and insure as a first car will have quite cheap road tax on them, but that's not absolutely always going to be the case, and it can be quite expensive. So check on one of the government websites, which I'll link down below, first and foremost, to make sure that your car has actually got cheap tax on it. It would be very annoying if you found a car that had really cheap insurance, but the road tax was all the way through the roof. And if you live near a ULEZ zone, which wasn't really a thing when I started driving but is a thing now, then also consider whether or not you'll be driving into that zone often, because that can be quite expensive too. There are plenty of cheap cars that are ULEZ compliant, like my £400 VW Polo for example, so just find one that isn't going to charge you 12 quid a day to drive into London or whatever. I mentioned this point in a video previously on how to buy cheap cars, but make sure that you research the car that you're going to buy before you actually buy it. If you've done insurance and tax and worked out that all that is cheap, make sure you also have a look at the MOT history of the specific car that you're looking to buy. Make sure there's nothing sketchy in the past that you think might need you to spend a lot of money to keep it running. Also have a look on owners forums, as almost every car will have a forum with some kind of page where everyone talks about all the common problems of the cars. I am always on these forums looking at common problems and reliability issues with cars because it's really useful for my YouTube videos, and so you could definitely go and do that if you're planning on actually buying a car as your first. I really do think reliability and dependability are super important on a first car. I don't think they need to be absolutely perfect, but they do need to be as good as possible, with maybe a few tiny issues here and there that you can actually fix yourself. Gets you learning how to work on cars, it's a bit character building, all that good stuff. But you really don't want a car that has major issues with it, so make sure you have done your research. To that point, something that people often overlook is the fact that less mileage doesn't actually mean that it's in better condition. Mileage is often a good indicator of condition if you compare the mileage to service history and that kind of stuff, but it's not the be all and end all of every car. Actually try to visit cars and see their condition in person. My Skoda Fabia estate had 64,000 miles on it when I bought it, which is actually relatively reasonable for that car at the time, and yet it was in actually quite bad condition as it had been used as a workman's car, travelling with bricks and dogs and all that kind of stuff. My MX-5 on the other hand, despite the rust and shocks, was actually in really good condition at 113,000 miles when I bought it, with a still strong engine. Mileage is genuinely not everything to do with a car's condition. Actually go and have a look at the cars and find out what the condition is that they're in. The penultimate one I wanted to talk about was think about the previous owners, not only from an insurance perspective in case you get a car that might have been modified or whatever, because that can run up your premiums, but also from a general ownership perspective. I think ideally you want a car that has actually been used as a runaround or a family car or whatever by an experienced driver. I often see that cars that have had a lot of use for a long time from an experienced driver tend to be in pretty reasonable shape. Ones that have been used by new drivers can sometimes have gearbox issues from harsh changes and that kind of stuff, and ones that have sat still for a long time get classic lack of use gremlins. Now that's not always the case, and I'm massively overgeneralizing here, but it's worth thinking about regardless. I wouldn't want to buy my car off of someone else who just had it as their first car and absolutely crunched the gearbox. And the final one, another very important one, is to be patient. Buying a car takes time. You'll inevitably want to get out on the roads as soon as possible after you finish your test, but not everything has to happen straight away. It took me well over a month after passing my test to actually find the right first car, get insured on it, buy it, all that good stuff, and actually begin driving. Give it time, find the right car at the right price with the right insurance that does all the right things for you, and it'll get you out on the roads feeling happy. So I hope you found this useful. I hope this helps with the buying of your first car, and I hope you enjoyed watching me cruise around Bedford Autodrome in my MX-5. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you hit the like button. I'd really appreciate it. Subscribe as well if you're new. A massive thank you to the patrons for their continued support, and to you guys as well for watching. I'll see you in the next one.
Listen.